Chinese President Xi Jinping addresses the BRICS Summit. What was his message and what sort of relationship with China can we expect from Joe Biden, the projected winner of the U.S. presidential election, when he takes over as anticipated on January 20th? Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. The BRICS Summit, which is being hosted by Russia, is taking place virtually this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech to the international gathering on Tuesday by video link from Beijing. He discussed several important issues, including the fight against the coronavirus, the global economy, and the need for international cooperation.
We BRICS countries must hold high the banner of multilateralism. We must endeavor to safeguard the UN-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law. We need to oppose interference in others' internal affairs, as well as unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction.
And the China-U.S. relationship has been strained during the Trump administration. How might that change under a Biden presidency? Well, to discuss all of this, joining me now from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. With us too via Skype from Washington, D.C. is Yukon Huang. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Asia Program. Also joining us is Sourabh Gupta. He is a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. And with us too is Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian affairs expert and professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Einar Tangen, let me start with you. We just heard President Xi Jinping there stressing the need for multilateralism and cooperation. What is your overview of President Xi's address to the BRICS gathering, and what do you think was the key message he was trying to convey?
Well, quite frankly, he was trying to say that there should be a much more powerful leadership role of this group of 5 countries. He's talking about multilateralism, but he's in a very different position. He has the only economy that represented at this group that is actually working. So he's trying, I think, to make sure that people realize that China is not going to exploit this opportunity, but to see it as a example of how you have a shared future. So I think it's a very positive message, but perhaps very different from the other messages that were put out there.
I know, and given that there is, we anticipate change in the United States in just a few months, was President Xi also trying here to reaffirm his commitment to multilateralism, to globalization?
Absolutely, but this is going to play better with the Biden administration than the Trump administration. In essence, what you have with Biden is he's going to be putting political pressure on China using multilateral institutions and also perhaps creating new ones. He's been talking about this kind of conference of democratic countries. But it should be better in the sense that it won't be this kind of militaristic approach that Donald Trump had, nor is it expected that he will be using the kind of economic hammer to push China down. Actually, they need to cooperate together, not only on this, but also restoring the multilateral institutions, also the environment. So there are some hopeful areas where the two can come together and hopefully build trust so that in the future there won't be these kind of negative sentiments, especially as evidenced in the U.S. and also in Europe these days.
Yukon Huang, we also heard calls for a new global deal, especially for developing economies. Leaders like South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa are concerned about their economies taking a direct hit from the pandemic. How important is globalization and cooperation as BRICS countries start to deal with coming out of this economic recession that they found themselves in with the pandemic?
Well, Anton, as you noted, President Xi's speech focused on multilateralism because he's emphasizing issues like the COVID pandemic. You need global cooperation. You need a strong role for WHO. He talked about the recovery. The recovery depends upon increasing trade relations, a stronger role, for example, for the WTO. You need a more coordinated approach among the major economic powers to revive the economy. President Xi also talked about sustained growth. You talk also about climate change. These are all issues that require collaboration. And therefore, I think that the multilateralism is a key component. Developing countries are hit by this pandemic more than the other countries. They lack the resources. There's a debt reduction program that's going on that will be helpful. And China, I think, is an active participant in this in a broad way for the first time. So I think that these are the concerns out there. Developing countries share these concerns. China, as other speakers have noted, China is the only major economy which will have positive growth, and therefore it can play a significant role in this process.
Yukon, how important is a group like BRICS in pushing forward this agenda of globalization, of dropping barriers, of more cooperation around the world?
I think that the BRICS have reached a little bit of a milestone in terms of what they are, where they want to go. In some ways, they're, in my view, more unified 3 or 4 or 5 years ago than they are today. And why is that? I think it's because some of the global tensions have affected the relationships. So you have a strain between India and China because of the border disputes. President Bolsonaro in Brazil, he has not been a strong advocate of some of these multilateral initiatives. He doesn't take the pandemic as seriously. He's tied to a more populist agenda. So I think that the support for BRIC agenda from Brazil viewpoint has been less forthcoming than it has been. So I think you're also finding a little bit of a separate objectives now being put forward by some of these leaders, more so today than has been in the past.
Sourabh Gupta, for the first time, this BRICS meeting also unveiled a joint counter-terrorism strategy. What would India's leader, Narendra Modi, want to get out of this BRICS meeting?
That's a good question, what exactly he wanted to do, because we're certainly not living in the 9/11 age per se. But I think he wanted to mainstream terrorism, and this is an issue he has mainstreamed at other multilateral venues too, because he, I think, sees it unfair that people are not strong enough to condemn Pakistan on many terrorist-related issues. He is, as we know, also fixated on that relationship in some regards. But this is not something which is new per se in Indian diplomacy. India has been advocating against a anti-terrorism convention for quite some time. And I think what he's trying to do out here is try to find ways to keep mainstreaming that within the larger UN and multilateral agenda. And that's not a bad thing at all, because we see too much recourse to violence, whether state-led violence or definitely by non-state actors. It's not tolerable, and I think that's generally the direction where he wants to go. But I would say at the end of the day, it is a bit jarring to hear a conversation of anti-terrorism this year, particularly in a year of COVID-19, when we all need to come together to collaborate.
And how important is it for India to get these other 4 partners on board if it were come to drawing up some kind of an anti-terrorism convention or some agreement?
Well, the very fact that they have been able to put out a statement itself shows that that the other countries are sympathetic up to a point to India's concerns on terrorism, and they know that in the Modi government, to some extent, has been an outlier within the BRICS grouping in terms of collaboration on many of the areas. I mean, India has collaborated sincerely, but it has not shown the enthusiasm, perhaps, that it could have. And they understand that India is a very big emerging market. India is a very important country in the international system. And even if they don't see eye to eye with India on some of these fronts, it's important that, at least in terms of the multilateral conversation, that they can carry forward together with India than having India somewhat at a distance. Because India is, at the end of the day, from a perspective of global multilateralism, a very important country.
Anton, Fedyashin, this year's BRICS Summit was supposed to be held in St. Petersburg in Russia, but of course we had the pandemic, and like most other international gatherings, these things had to be rescheduled into virtual summits. President Putin hosted this year's event virtually. How important is the BRICS Summit for Russia as it tries to get its economy moving?
Exceptionally important, and Einar was absolutely right that of the 5 BRICS countries, of course, China's economy is by far the best performing, and Russia has a ways to go. But I think that the far-looking leaders of the world are already thinking in terms of, yes, going through tougher times in the next few months, but then the world economy bouncing back in 2021, going into 22. And the question is, on whose terms will that happen? For me, what was particularly important about the speeches today, both Xi's speech and Putin's, was comparing them to what's coming out of Washington right now and out of the Biden campaign specifically, technically in Wilmington, of course, out of the Biden team, rather, no longer the campaign. Because there seems to be an attempt to remind the world and to re-emphasize the content of terms. We heard the terms multilateral, we heard the terms multipolar on several occasions today in the speeches. Those are not terms that are used by the Biden team. With the incoming American administration, the terms are bringing the United States back to the head of the table and essentially reclaiming leadership of the world. And Xi's emphasis on the UN as the focal point of international relations in all spheres of human activity is a very interesting counterbalance to the way that the future, the soon-to-be Biden administration sees this new post-pandemic order, which is Western-led and U.S.-led, to be more specific. And this reminds me, as a matter of fact, very much of the difference in the rhetoric between the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1980s, when both Reagan and Bush and Gorbachev, on the other hand, thought in terms of a new world order after the Cold War. But in the American case, it was very interesting. The New World Order was spoken in terms of an internationalism that was led by the United States, whereas Gorbachev thought in terms of a New World Order that was pluralistic, inclusive, and not led by one country or even one civilization, that being the West, but led by the UN, except that back then, of course, Gorbachev's vision was in decline and the Soviet Union would be no more. But today it's interesting because it is the Chinese, the Russian, the Indian, the BRICS vision that seems to be on the upswing. We'll see how it turns out in 21.
So, Anton, talking about balance of power, how does Russia see this? Because we know that there is a lot of tension, or has been a lot of tension between Russia and the United States for quite some time. So how does Russia see that its membership of BRICS as a counterbalance to that?
Russia sees BRICS as a parallel organization to the other Western created and Western European and US dominated organizations. And it sees it as an alternative, not as a tool for a direct challenge. The Russians aren't strong enough to challenge the West, and frankly, I don't think they're terribly interested in it. But they do see the BRICS, and especially the financial clout that the BRICS have created through the banking system, the investment system that they've created, as an alternative focal point for countries to make a decision about which development model they want to follow, one that is more laden with political demands such as come out of the West, or one that is laden with fewer political demands.
Einar Tangen, of course, this meeting took place virtually because of the pandemic. President Xi talked about the pandemic, and he talks about China's cooperation with other BRICS nations, especially on things like vaccines to fight COVID-19. Let's listen.
As we speak, Chinese companies are working with their Russian and Brazilian partners on phase 3 clinical trials of vaccines. And we are prepared to have cooperation with South Africa and India as well.
So, Anna, how can BRICS nations cooperate in this fight against the pandemic?
Well, it comes down to cost and distribution. Obviously, there's got to be something that's affordable, and there's going to have to be some sort of subsidy. The question is how that comes together, what the BRICS play in comparison to COVAX, which is that global idea of somehow addressing all of these needs. But remember, these BRICS nations are the middle market. They're the emerging nations. There are a lot of countries that are down below. And the question is, will they establish leadership by taking on this challenge and making it really something that is, quote, shared values? I think Xi Jinping has made that very clear, that he sees a role there, and that will be a kind of defining. But you know, at this moment in time, you have very different voices. And when you say it's a virtual, pointed out the virtual nature of this, right. I think that's a disadvantage. With such strong leaders, you need them to actually come together, have sideline meetings, talk through some of their issues, something you can't do while you're simply speaking into, you know, a camera.
Yukon Huang, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is predicting that the world economy will shrink by more than 4% this year. President Xi has talked about that, his concern for that, and he's talked about economic recovery, saying that openness and innovation needs to lead the way if we are going to recover, if the world is going to recover. How important will this be for the rest of the world?
Well, first, let me differentiate between China's recovery and the recovery going on in the U.S. and the Europe. China's recovery has been led by industrial production and exports, and less so by consumption. Although in the last month or so, consumption has basically started to revive. So China's exports have surged, and has been exporting not only medical equipment, but computers, household furnishings. And the reason is that the pandemic has disrupted production supply networks in other countries, but China has basically been able to get back on track much faster. In the West, the recovery has been much more led by consumption, supported by budget fiscal support. So there is a difference. But now they basically have to go on the same kind of a path of being more complementary, and I think it's going to happen. So I think that you're going to see in the coming months revival both in the West and in China accelerating. And that's why you see what I call positive growth rates for 2021 as opposed to the negative global recession for this year. So this requires, I think, a much more coordinated approach. And you need what I call both fiscal support, not only in the West, but you also need supportive policies in China.
Sourabh Gupta, on January 20th next year, Joe Biden is expected to take over as President of the United States. What can we expect from him when it comes to globalization and multilateralism? Can we expect to see rather, a United States that's more engaged with the world?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I would expect so. You know, there will be a lot of engagement. How much of that will then be memorialized in terms of U.S. law, in terms of its commitments to the multilateral system, that remains to be seen, because Congress is not very facilitative of championing multilateralism, even though a Democratic president is. But I would say on multiple dimensions, we will see progress. We will see progress immediately in terms of on the public health front, with him rejoining the WTO, providing funds, and also I would assume assisting in the distribution of vaccines overseas, not just back at home. Obviously, anticipate him engaging in a very significantly positive way in terms of climate change. I would expect that at some point down the line, but pretty soon, within the first year, he's going to give a neutrality pledge in terms of U.S. emissions, that being 2050. Again, the important point is how much of this gets memorialized in terms of U.S. law. That is the issue that's up to question. And we must just hope that in terms of the international monetary system, in terms of international trade, and in terms of international investment, and also when I talk international investment, I'm talking in terms of export controls and licensing controls that the U.S. is being imposing. So long as it doesn't get any worse and it gradually improves, I think that's good enough. The U.S. is not in a good situation politically, on the economic side to make great commitments, but I would hope that at least that there's that aspiration to re-engage with globalization and participate within it and champion it and lead it also, because the US is still a huge economy and a very productive contributor to the international system.
Anton, Fedyashin, Vice President Joe Biden has been talking about re-establishing the United States presence on the world stage. To what extent do you think those kinds of policies will be a departure from what we heard from Donald Trump, the Make America Great Again sentiments that he expressed, and which actually meant the United States pulling away from major international organizations and international engagement?
Well, I think the departure will be profound in style because the United States will re-engage in international organizations under Joe Biden. Moreover, the administration is bound to be a lot more predictable. It's bound to be predictable, period, unlike what we've seen over the past 4 years in this building right behind me. However, the question is what kind of engagement or re-engagement, as the Biden team likes to put it, will this be? This will be an attempt to reestablish American dominance at a time when the tectonic geopolitical shifts on our planet have gone beyond any kind of an attempt to restore American hegemony, American power, American influence. The whole world is moving towards regionalism, both geopolitically but also economically. And by the way, the BRICS is one of the most serious attempts at essentially creating a community of nations that has an important voice in determining the rules by which the global economic game is played. And remember, this is coming after roughly, give or take, 300 years of indisputed Western dominance. So we'll see how the Biden administration approaches this. The worst that they can do is barge in there and try to reestablish full American influence.
And Anton, what would a Biden presidency mean for relations with Russia?
Well, listen, things cannot get any worse than they already are. And it's interesting because in Moscow, the attitude is simply wait and see. The Russians have given up on trying to repair the relationship because every time they tried to make some kind of offer, it was either ignored or they were blamed for making it. So there seems to be the attitude, the reigning attitude in Moscow right now is strategic patience. They're waiting to see what the Americans decide to do. They're not expecting any breakthroughs, but they are expecting predictability, which in international politics, same as in business, is better even if you expect things to get worse, because at least you can plan, you can create scenarios of power. The best that the Biden administration can do is actually pull off a Nixon moment. The same that Nixon and Kissinger did with China back in 1972. Biden offers a laurel wreath to the Russians. They try to reestablish a workable dialogue and start digging their way, or climbing their way in this case, out of the hole into which both countries have gotten themselves over the past 4 or 5 years.
And Einar Tangen, looking at the relationship with China, President Trump, of course, started a trade war with China. He also imposed sanctions and restrictions against Chinese companies. Do you think Joe Biden will change any of that?
Yes, as I said earlier, I mean, he's going to take a kind of political a challenge to China. He wants to get a group of nations, democratic capitalist nations, who are, in essence, trying to put peer pressure on China to change. Now, that isn't going to succeed because China's been very successful with its model, even through this COVID-19, handling both the health and economic affairs so far. So it's just not going to work in that regard. But I would agree with my colleagues, the tone will be quite different. It's not going to be this confrontational, don't expect less freedom of navigation patrols through these areas, fewer, no more sanctions and things like that, economic ones, although it'll be hard to see exactly how much that will be withdrawn. But, let's talk about a slightly larger issue. I think a lot of nations are doing a wait-and-see attitude, not only on this administration, but on the United States as a reliable partner. Because at this juncture, there's 150,000 votes in battleground states that determined who was going to be president, despite the popular vote being in favor of Biden. So the question is, these 73 million people who voted for Trump, will they still be a factor next time in 2024? What is the direction of the United States? Biden is an old school, middle of the road kind of guy, but it seems like America is going more towards the fringes. And the question is, where is that going?
Sourabh, that's a key point that Einar Tangen raises there. More than 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, 72 million actually. Would the anti-Chinese sentiment that Trump built up when he was in office in the United States, especially on issues of trade, make it more difficult for Joe Biden to reverse some of the measures that Donald Trump took?
I think definitely yes. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of negative press day after day. It's not the factual parts that are there. I mean, they don't produce them. They just simply continue to pound away that China is the enemy, kind of like many of his efforts in terms of the election.
Sourabh, what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, yes, he will move away from some of the egregious ones, the ones which are obviously internationally illegal, which violate international law. He'll find a way to move away from those, particularly I think on the tariff front. But a lot of the denials and export controls which have happened on the international investment front, they are not illegal actions. There's nothing illegal about it. And maybe he will utilize that judiciously to find greater opening from China in terms of leveling the playing field in terms of industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. But bottom line is, he will be up for re-election in 2024. The blue-collar vote will be on the ballot, and these battleground swing states where that blue-collar vote is predominant will be the indispensable voters who will be required to get to 270, and that essentially means that Biden's hands will be constrained.
Right. Yukon Huang, very quickly, the United States, of course, walked away from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now known as the CPTPP. Do you think Biden might want to get back into those negotiations?
Well, he probably harbors intentions to do so, but the likelihood of him being able to move forward is very, very low. Democrats are very much against these kinds of trade relations. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was against the TPP for political reasons. So I suspect that Biden's going to bide his time. So he's got a problem because China and the rest of Asia just passed the RCEP. And without a U.S. presence either in RCEP or in the TPP, its influence in what I call economic and trade tensions or trade issues in the Asia region is going to be limited. So I think that is a problem for the Biden administration.
All right. Thanks to all of you. Time has caught up with us. We need to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on yet another edition of The Heat. Thank you.